"Sir, we need to inspect your bag. We've received concerning reports about suspicious activity." The words cut through the hushed cabin of Flight 237, deliberately loud enough for every passenger to hear. All eyes turned to seat 2C, where Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Bennett sat perfectly still, the classified intelligence in his messenger bag suddenly at risk of exposure. 15 years of distinguished military service, 3 combat deployments, and a chest full of medals that weren't visible. Beneath his tailored civilian suit, none of it mattered in this moment. What mattered was the color of his skin and the fear it had triggered in someone who saw a threat where there was only duty. 4 hours earlier, as Elijah had navigated Reagan National Airport with the practiced vigilance of a career intelligence officer, he'd had no idea that his greatest challenge today wouldn't be the classified briefing awaiting him in Seattle, but simply existing in first class while Black Elijah checked his watch, a vintage Omega his father had given him after his first deployment, and made his way toward the priority boarding line for Flight 237 to Seattle. In less than 4 hours, he would be briefing the Joint Special Operations Command on intelligence that could reshape American security operations in the South China Sea. But for now, he was simply another first-class passenger, his calm exterior betraying nothing of the classified documents secured in his government-issued tablet or the weight of his mission. When the boarding announcement chimed through the terminal, Elijah waited patiently, observing his surroundings with practiced ease. His eyes catalogued details most would miss. The slightly frayed uniform of a gate agent, the nervous energy of a young man clutching his backpack too tightly, the stiff formality of the lead flight attendant checking boarding passes with mechanical precision. "First-class passengers may now board," announced a cheerful voice. Elijah stepped forward, presenting his boarding pass and ID with a polite nod. The gate agent barely glanced at his face, her eyes flickering briefly to his hand and back to her screen. "Seat 2C, on the right," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Elijah had grown used to these subtle shifts in expression, these momentary recalibrations that happened when people saw his brown skin against the backdrop of privilege. After 15 years in military intelligence and countless missions across 5 continents, he had developed an emotional armor against microaggressions that others might find debilitating. Today was no different. He made his way onto the aircraft, stowing his bag in the overhead compartment before settling into his window seat. The first-class cabin filled slowly around him, a silver-haired executive in an expensive suit, a middle-aged couple in matching vacation wear, a young tech entrepreneur, already buried in her laptop. Elijah pulled out his phone, sending a brief encrypted message confirming his departure time before switching to airplane mode. Flight attendant Vanessa Wright moved efficiently through the cabin, her platinum blonde hair pulled into a tight bun that emphasized her sharp cheekbones. At 36, Vanessa had mastered the art of the perfect airline smile, warm enough to seem welcoming, but distant enough to maintain authority. For 12 years, she had worked her way up from regional routes to international first class, pride in her pristine service record, evident in every precise movement. "Good morning, sir," she greeted the elderly man in 1A warmly, offering champagne with practiced grace. "Welcome aboard." "Good morning," she nodded to the couple in 1D and 1F, her smile professional. When she reached Elijah's row, something imperceptible shifted in her demeanor. The smile remained fixed, but a coolness crept into her voice, her eyes not quite meeting his. "Something to drink?" she asked, her tone noticeably flatter than it had been moments before. "Just water, please," Elijah replied, meeting her gaze steadily. Vanessa nodded curtly and moved on, missing the slight tightening around Elijah's eyes, the only indication that he had noticed the difference in her manner. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Captain David Sullivan's voice filled the cabin with the standard welcome announcements. Elijah gazed out the window, his mind already shifting to the mission ahead. The intelligence he carried detailed a network of influence operations targeting American military technology, a sophisticated campaign that had already compromised several defense contractors. What he didn't know was that 30,000 feet above the American heartland, he would find himself fighting a different battle altogether, one where his rank, his record, and his 15 years of distinguished service would be rendered invisible by nothing more than the color of his skin. 3. Hours into the flight, the cabin had settled into the drowsy rhythm of long-haul travel. Most passengers dozed or watched movies, the white noise of the engines creating a cocoon of shared solitude. Elijah had been reviewing unclassified portions of his presentation, making notes on his tablet with meticulous attention to detail. Nigh the galley, Vanessa Wright was having a hushed conversation with her colleague, Jessica Parker. Their voices were low, but tension radiated from their stiff postures. "I've been watching him since takeoff," Vanessa whispered, her eyes darting toward 2C. "He hasn't put that tablet down once, keeps checking his watch, and went through his bag twice like he was looking for something." Jessica frowned. "So? Lots of business travelers work during flights." "It's not just that," Vanessa insisted. "He's too alert, too watchful. And did you see how he's positioned himself? Back to the wall, clear view of both exits. That's not normal behavior." "You're being paranoid," Jessica replied, though uncertainty had crept into her voice. "Just because this isn't about that," Vanessa cut her off sharply. "I've been flying long enough to recognize suspicious behavior." What Vanessa couldn't articulate, even to herself, was how Elijah's presence in first class violated her unconscious expectations, how his calm confidence felt somehow threatening rather than reassuring, how his watchfulness registered as suspicious rather than professional. In 15 years of flying, she had learned to trust her instincts about passengers, but she had never examined how those instincts might be shaped by biases she refused to acknowledge. When Elijah stood to stretch his legs and visited the lavatory, Vanessa's eyes tracked him. When he returned to his seat and opened his messenger bag to retrieve a small notebook, her suspicion crystallized into certainty. "I'm calling the captain," she decided, reaching for the interphone. In the cockpit, Captain Sullivan listened too, Vanessa's concerns with growing unease. After 12 years working together, he trusted her judgment, even when her evidence seemed circumstantial at best. "Keep an eye on him," he instructed. "I'll alert our air marshal." 20 minutes later, as Elijah was finishing his meal, he noticed a change in the cabin atmosphere. The flight attendants moved with new purpose, their casual efficiency replaced by tense alertness. A man in 7B who had been reading quietly throughout the flight now sat straighter, his attention seemingly fixed on the in-flight entertainment system, but his awareness clearly directed elsewhere. Elijah recognized the signs. Immediately, the air marshal had been activated. Years of training had taught him to identify security personnel in any environment, and the sudden shift in the man's posture was textbook. What Elijah couldn't determine was the target of this heightened surveillance, until he caught Vanessa's eyes darting repeatedly in his direction. The realization settled like ice in his stomach. He was being watched. With deliberate calm, he closed his tablet and tucked it into his bag. Whatever was happening, escalation would only complicate matters. He signaled for assistance, and Jessica approached, her smile tight. "Could I get another?" "Water, please?" he asked pleasantly. "Of course, sir," she replied, her politeness mechanical. As she walked away, Elijah noticed Vanessa at the galley phone again, her back turned, but her posture rigid with urgency. Within minutes, the man from 7B stood and made his way casually toward the forward cabin, taking position near the bulkhead with a clear line of sight to Elijah's seat. The choreography was clear now. They believed he was a threat. Before Elijah could decide on his next move, Vanessa approached, flanked by the man he had identified as the air marshal. Her voice carried through the quiet cabin, deliberately loud enough for others to hear. "Sir, we need to inspect your bag. We've received concerning reports about suspicious activity." Conversations stopped. Heads turned. In an instant, Elijah became the focus of every passenger's attention. "On what grounds?" he asked quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through his system. "Security protocol," Vanessa replied crisply. "We have reason to believe you may be carrying prohibited items." The air marshal stepped forward. "Sir, please cooperate. This is a standard security check." Elijah assessed his options rapidly. He could identify himself, reveal his military status and the nature of his mission, but operational security prohibited disclosure of his identity except in extreme circumstances. He could refuse the search, but that would only escalate the situation. Or he could comply, allowing them to search his belongings while maintaining his cover. "My bag contains government property," he said evenly. "I am not authorized to allow its search without proper clearance." Vanessa's expression hardened. "That's not an option, sir. Either you comply voluntarily, or we will be forced to take further measures." Around them, passengers were now openly staring, some recording the confrontation on their phones. Elijah could read the narrative forming in their eyes. Not a man defending his rights, but a threat being neutralized. Not an officer serving his country, but a suspect resisting authority. With measured movements, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a military ID and badge. "Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Bennett, United States Army Intelligence. The contents of my bag are classified, and I am under orders not to surrender them to unauthorized personnel." For a moment, the cabin went silent. The air marshal leaned forward, examining the credentials with a frown. Vanessa's expression flickered between disbelief and dawning horror. "I can contact my commanding officer to verify my identity," Elijah continued calmly. "But I recommend we continue this conversation in private rather than alarming the other passengers." The air marshal straightened, his demeanor shifting subtly. "Sir, if you could come with us to the rear galley to sort this out." As Elijah stood, dignity intact but acutely aware of the dozens of eyes following his movement, he caught fragments of whispered judgments. "Military?" a woman murmured. "He doesn't look like... Why didn't he just say so from the beginning?" another replied. Elijah kept his expression neutral, the same face he had worn in interrogation rooms and hostile territories across the globe. But beneath that composure, a familiar pain resurfaced, the constant burden of proving his legitimacy in spaces where others were presumed to belong. In the rear galley, away from curious eyes, the real investigation began. The rear galley was cramped, made smaller by the tension filling the space between the four people now huddled there. Elijah stood with his back straight, military bearing evident in every line of his body. Across from him, the air marshal, who had identified himself as Federal Agent Kevin Randall, examined his credentials with professional thoroughness. "These appear legitimate," Randall admitted, returning the ID. "However, we still need to verify your identity and status." Captain Sullivan, who had joined them from the cockpit, frowned. Lieutenant Colonel, you understand we have protocols to follow. When security concerns are raised, I understand the protocols, Captain, Elijah replied evenly. What I don't understand is what security concerns prompted this intervention in the first place. All eyes turned to Vanessa, whose composure had begun to crack around the edges. Her perfect posture remained, but uncertainty had crept into her expression.
He was behaving suspiciously, she stated, though her voice carried less conviction now. Constant vigilance, unusual attention to his surroundings, protective of his bag, checking it repeatedly. Standard operational security for anyone carrying.
Classified materials, Elijah observed quietly. How was I supposed to know that? Vanessa asked defensively. Elijah met her gaze directly. You weren't. But you might ask yourself why my behavior registered as threatening rather than professional. Why, out of all the passengers working on laptops or guarding their belongings, I was the one who triggered your suspicion. A flush crept up Vanessa's neck. This isn't about, I would have reported anyone acting the way you were. Would you? Elijah asked, his tone not accusatory but genuinely questioning. The satellite phone rang, breaking the tense moment. Agent Randall answered, stepping aside for a brief, quiet conversation before returning to the group. That was my supervisor, he informed them. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett's identity and mission are confirmed. He's cleared at the highest levels. He turned to Elijah. Sir, my apologies for the inconvenience. Captain Sullivan nodded gravely. Lieutenant Colonel, please accept our sincere apologies as well. We'll return to your seat immediately. Actually, Elijah said, I'd like a moment. With Ms. Wright first, privately. The captain and air marshal exchanged glances but nodded, moving toward the front of the aircraft and leaving Elijah and Vanessa alone in the galley. For several seconds, neither spoke. Vanessa stood rigid, her professional mask firmly back in place, though her eyes revealed her discomfort. I'm not going to file a complaint, Elijah said finally. Surprise flashed across her face. You're not? No. But I would like you to understand something. He paused, choosing his words carefully. For 15 years, I've served this country in ways I can't discuss and places I can't name. I've led teams into situations where trust was the only currency that mattered. And throughout my career, I've had to work twice as hard to earn that trust because people see my skin before they see my uniform. Vanessa's eyes dropped. What happened today isn't unusual for me, he continued. Being questioned, doubted, assumed guilty, these are experiences I've had since I was a teenager. The difference is that today, I had credentials to protect me. Many don't. I was just doing my job, Vanessa said quietly, following security protocols. The protocols didn't tell you to watch me more closely than other passengers, Elijah responded. That was a choice. Maybe not a conscious one, but a choice nonetheless. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card, offering it to her. This is the contact information for the military's Diversity and Bias Awareness Program. They offer civilian training as well. I recommend it, not because I want to punish you, but because I believe you when you say you were trying to do your job well. This might help you do it better. Vanessa stared at the card for a long moment before accepting it, her fingers trembling slightly. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words clearly difficult for her. I didn't think I was. Few of us do, Elijah replied gently. The question is what we do once we recognize it. When Lieutenant Colonel Bennett returned to his seat, the cabin fell silent. Passengers who had been openly recording the earlier confrontation now averted, their eyes suddenly fascinated by their entertainment screens or the clouds outside. The air marshal had resumed his seat, professional neutrality masking any emotion he might feel about the incident. Captain Sullivan's voice came over the intercom shortly after. "Ladies and gentlemen, we want to apologize for any disruption to your flight experience. The security matter has been resolved fully, and we thank you for your patience. We'll be beginning our descent into Seattle in approximately 40 minutes. What the announcement couldn't address, were the lessons hidden within the encounter, the uncomfortable truths exposed at 30,000 feet where there was nowhere to hide from one's own assumptions. In the galley, Vanessa Wright stood alone, the small contact card clutched in her hand like a lifeline. In 15 years of flying, she had prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to handle difficult situations, and her fair treatment of all passengers. Now, that self-image lay shattered at her feet, forcing her to confront questions she had avoided throughout her career. For Elijah, the incident would become one more story in a lifetime collection of similar moments. Airports where he was randomly selected for additional screening, upscale stores where security followed him discreetly, neighborhoods where police slowed their cruisers as he jogged. The weight of these experiences had shaped him, but never defined him. As the aircraft began its descent into Seattle, Jessica approached his seat with a fresh glass of water and a sincere, if uncomfortable, smile. "Lieutenant Colonel, can I get you anything else before we land?" "No, thank you," he replied. "I'm fine." And he was fine, resilient in ways that those who had never faced such challenges could never fully understand. In a few hours, he would stand before the Joint Special Operations Command, delivering intelligence crucial to national security. The officers in that room would see his uniform first, his achievements second, and perhaps never consider how many invisible barriers he had overcome to stand before them. On the ground, as passengers disembarked, Vanessa stood at the forward door, a professional smile firmly in place as she thanked each person for flying with them. When Elijah approached, she met his eyes directly for the first time. "Thank you for your service, Lieutenant Colonel," she said, the words carrying a weight beyond their usual perfunctory courtesy. He nodded, understanding the beginning of something in her acknowledgement. Not forgiveness sought or granted, but recognition, awareness, the first step toward change. As he walked through the jet bridge toward the terminal where two uniformed officers waited to escort him to his classified briefing, Elijah reflected on the dual missions of his life. Serving his country through his military duties, and serving it equally through these more personal encounters, these moments where prejudice met principle, where bias confronted honor, where the true measure of his service went far beyond any medal or commendation he had received. Behind him, Vanessa watched his departing figure, the card still in her pocket. Tomorrow, she will make a call. Tomorrow, she will begin her own mission of understanding. Tomorrow, the encounter at 30,000 feet would become not just an embarrassing mistake, but the catalyst for transformation. In the sky above them, another aircraft took flight, carrying hundreds of strangers bound together in a temporary community, each bringing their own invisible baggage of assumptions and experiences. In countless similar encounters playing out across the country, in offices and classrooms, in stores and on streets, the same human drama unfolded, the struggle to see beyond the surface, to recognize dignity regardless of difference, to build a world where no one had to prove they belonged. For today, one small victory had been won at 30,000 feet, not through confrontation, but through connection, not through accusation, but through understanding. One step closer to the higher ground that all of humanity sought to reach together.